The boy with the copper chain, the small town of Ashok Nagar in Tamil Nadu, breathed its usual breath of dust, incense, and resilience. The year was 1985. It was the kind of place where the morning sun painted the sky a golden hue and where the aroma of freshly boiled filter coffee would drift through every home like a blessing. In this modest neighborhood, where coconut trees cast long shadows and auto rickshaws coughed their way through narrow streets, lived a boy named Sundar. He was not a boy of many possessions. His family lived in a two-room apartment in an old government building. His father, Sundar Pichai, was an electrical engineer at GEC, and his mother, Lakshmi, had given up her job as a stenographer to raise her two sons. But there was something Sundar always wore, a thin, copper-colored necklace. It wasn't fashionable or shiny. It wasn't even gold. It was, to most of his classmates, unimpressive, even laughable. To Sundar, however, it was a symbol, not of wealth or prestige, but of remembrance. It had been a gift from his grandfather, a quiet, stern man who passed away when Sundar was only 6. Always keep this close, Kanna, his grandfather had said on his final day in their home. It's not the metal that matters. It's what you make of it. Sundar didn't fully understand then, but the necklace never left his neck. The classroom judgment be the time Sundar reached 8th grade. He was known at school for one thing, his silence. Not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that drew attention anyway. He rarely talked in class, except to answer questions, which he often got right. But that necklace, it became the center of more attention than his achievements. During recess, one day, a classmate named Rajiv sneered at him while munching on a samosa. "Hey, why don't you get rid of that scrap metal?" Sundar looked like it came from a junk shop. A few others chuckled. Even the teacher, Mr. Prakash, a strict man with a penchant for sarcasm, looked at him oddly sometimes. One day, in front of the whole class, Mr. Prakash asked, "Why do you keep wearing that necklace, Pichai? Don't your parents earn enough to get you something proper?" The classroom erupted with laughter. Sundar's ears burned red. He looked down, clutching the chain between his fingers, but he didn't reply. He never did. The real lessons began despite the ridicule. Sundar carried himself with quiet dignity. Every morning, he would help his mother clean the floor with cow dung paste, and in the evenings, he would sit beside his father listening to radio broadcasts in English, BBC News, Voice of America, the voices that sounded like faraway lands, promising things he couldn't yet grasp. He had no computer at home, not even a landline phone. Yet, he had something else, an obsession with how things worked. Every time his father returned from work with a broken transistor or a fuse box, Sundar would sit beside him, studying every wire, asking quiet but persistent questions. "Appa," he asked one evening, "how does a telephone remember a number?" His father smiled, placing the screwdriver down. "It doesn't remember, Kanna. We do. The machine just connects." That answer stayed with Sundar for years, even when the rest of the world tried to forget about him. The interview when Sundar was 16, he applied to IIT. It was an almost impossible dream. His family couldn't afford coaching classes. He studied under the dim light of a single bulb at night, surrounded by the humming of ceiling fans and the occasional creak of old window frames. He made it, but when he stepped into the hallowed halls of IIT Kharagpur, wearing the same copper necklace, he found the judgment followed him. One of his batchmates, during ragging, joked, planning to summon spirits with that thing. "Village boy." The laughter came again, and still, Sundar said nothing, but he studied harder than anyone else. Nights became a rhythm of caffeine, textbooks, and deep thought. He still didn't have a computer, but whenever the lab was open, he'd be there. First to arrive, last to leave. And one day, something changed. The email that changed it a lit was a humid afternoon when Sundar, now in his final year, logged into a lab computer and opened his email. There was a message from Stanford University. He had been accepted. It was the moment that should have made him jump, scream, run, but instead, Sundar simply sat back, closed his eyes, and remembered his grandfather's words. "It's what you make of it." His copper chain glinted faintly in the monitor's reflection. There was just one problem. He couldn't afford the ticket to America, a necklace, a sacrifice back home in Chennai. Sundar sat at the kitchen table, silent. His father, who had already borrowed for Sundar's IIT fees, knew the cost. We'll figure something out, he said, though his voice cracked. That night, Sundar took off his copper necklace for the first time in 12 years. The next morning, he walked into a local goldsmith shop. Can you melt this down? I need the money. The goldsmith examined it. It's not worth much, I know, Sundar whispered, but it means everything. The goldsmith looked at him, then back at the chain. Wait here. 10 minutes. Later, he returned, placing a small bundle of rupees on the counter. It's not what it's worth, he said. It's what you are worth. Take it. Sundar stood stunned. That was the first of many kindnesses that would come his way. His professors pooled money. A retired neighbor offered to co-sign a loan. His family sold their only scooter Dot, and on a cloudy morning in August 1993, Sundar stepped onto an airplane for the first time in his life, barefoot in spirit, burdened with dreams, but ready. The final scene as the plane soared above the clouds. Sundar looked out of the tiny window. The world below was shrinking. His mind raced, not with fear, but with possibility. He touched the spot where his necklace used to be Dot in its absence. Something else had formed, a quiet resolve, an iron belief that no matter how small the beginning, what you build with it is what truly matters. From shadows to silicon, the air felt different in California, thinner somehow, cleaner, and colder than any wind Sundar had ever felt in India. When he stepped out of the San Francisco airport, the city looked surreal. People walked briskly, dressed in layers of clothes, faces tucked into scarves, heads held down as if they had somewhere important to be, always. The buildings seemed to rise endlessly. So unlike the single-story homes and tiled roofs of Ashok Nagar, the roads were wide, too wide, and the traffic moved so quietly, so politely, that it made Sundar uneasy. It wasn't that he was afraid. It was something else, a sudden smallness, the realization that in this country of blinking crosswalks and steel towers, he was a stranger. Sundar's first days at Stanford were filled not with awe, but with something far more difficult to describe, a gnawing discomfort that came with being invisible. Nobody mocked his accent, but few understood him fully. Professors would pause slightly before pronouncing his name. Sundar became Sundar or Mr. Pichai. He never corrected them. He was too shy, too aware of how different he seemed in a place where students drove to class and used Toyotas and carried sleek laptops, things he'd only seen in magazines back home. He didn't have a car or even a proper winter coat. He had his shirts and a second-hand jacket that smelled of mothballs and hope. And still, he walked the university halls every day with his books held tightly against his chest like a shield. There was a deep silence in him during those early months. He missed his mother's voice humming over the clatter of dishes. He missed the clumsy warmth of a home where electricity often went out, but love never did. At Stanford, he lived in a tiny room in a shared graduate dorm, barely big enough to fit a single bed and a steel table. He would sit there for hours, reading not just textbooks on semiconductors and algorithms, but dictionaries, newspapers, even manuals, trying to conquer English the way he conquered equations piece by piece, with relentless precision. The words didn't scare him, but the loneliness did. Meals were often skipped, not for lack of hunger, but for lack of money. Some nights, he'd wait until his roommates had gone to bed, then quietly boil noodles on a hot plate he wasn't supposed to have, mixing them with leftover spices he had brought in a steel box from India. Other nights, he walked alone to the campus computer lab, more to distract himself than to study. He would sit there, sometimes till dawn, reading about emerging tech companies, names like Netscape, Apple, Microsoft, studying their structures, leadership, choices. He watched the world change in real time through code, wondering quietly where, if anywhere, a boy like him could fit. Then came a moment that shaped everything. One rainy afternoon, a professor invited Sundar to a lecture on human-computer interaction. It wasn't his specialty, but something about the invitation made him go. The speaker, a visiting engineer from a tech company, was explaining how design impacts user behavior, how people make decisions not by logic, but by emotion. He spoke of empathy in design, and something stirred in Sundar. Empathy, that elusive thing he'd hungered for. As he listened, it occurred to him that the most powerful tools in the world were not those with the most features, but those that made people feel seen, understood, respected. The thought electrified him. Technology wasn't just circuits and software. It was human behavior, shaped through machines. That night, Sundar walked back through the pouring rain, drenched and shivering, but on fire inside. He wrote pages of notes, diagrams, ideas, not for a project, not for a class, but for something he couldn't yet name. He didn't know it then, but he had taken his first step toward something larger than himself, the idea that technology, when guided by empathy, could reach billions, even those in places like Ashok Nagar with no internet, no computers, no fancy schools. And he, the boy with the copper necklace, could help shape it. In the semesters that followed, Sundar slowly began to find his footing. He started speaking up more in discussions, even when his voice trembled. He volunteered for group projects, even when others overlooked him at first. He sent emails to professors with questions, clarifications, and sometimes just a note of thanks, something rare enough to be noticed. People began to see him not as the silent outsider, but as someone with clarity, depth, and humility. He didn't win debates, but he won respect, quietly, consistently, despite his progress. There were still trials that came unannounced. One winter, while walking back from class, Sundar slipped on ice and twisted his ankle badly. The pain was sharp, but what hurt more was the knowledge that he couldn't afford medical care. He limped for days, relying on an old walking stick a fellow Indian student had lent him. He went to class anyway, took notes anyway, coded anyway. The limp passed, but the memory remained, another quiet reminder that he had no safety net. Only self-belief. During his final year at Stanford, Sundar applied for internships. Many companies didn't respond. One recruiter laughed on the phone and asked, "Do you even have a visa to work?" But one small startup took a chance on him. The role wasn't glamorous, mostly data sorting and back-end testing, but Sundar treated it like the opportunity of a lifetime. He worked 12 hours a day, never once late, never once dismissive of the tasks he was given. He read company code like scripture. He improved one internal tool so efficiently that a senior engineer asked, "Where'd you learn to think like that?" Sundar didn't know how to answer. He couldn't say it came from years of repairing transistors with his father or observing customer behavior outside roadside tea shops. He couldn't say it came from being the butt of jokes for a necklace or from boiling noodles in a dark dorm kitchen. So he simply said, "I pay attention," and that was enough. What followed was a series of quiet victories. He was offered a full-time job. He published a paper on data compression that caught the attention of industry veterans. He started gaining confidence, not in an arrogant way, but like someone who had finally begun to trust his own voice. He bought his first laptop, then a plane ticket home. After nearly 4 years, he returned to India, a different man, but with the same spirit. When he stepped back into his parents' home in Ashok Nagar, his mother burst into tears. His father looked at him and simply said, "Apadiya," a Tamil expression meaning, "So, this is how far you've come." Sundar didn't say much. He unpacked his bag, sat down on the floor, and from the very bottom of his suitcase, took out a small parcel wrapped in old newspaper. He opened it quietly. Inside lay the old copper necklace. His mother's eyes widened. "You brought it back." He nodded, fastening it around his neck once more. "It never left me," he said softly. The next chapter of his life, the chapter that would take him to Google, was still far away. But in that moment, he understood something deeply. The world may not always remember how we look, how we speak, or even how we dress, but it will remember how we make others feel and how we carry ourselves when no one's watching. The boy who had once been laughed at for wearing a copper chain in school was now a man who understood the quiet strength of humility. He had stood alone in labs, in airports, in conference rooms, but he had never let the world harden him, and that, more than any degree or title, would be his true legacy. The quiet mind in the loud room by the time Sundar returned to the United States. To begin his professional career, he had grown into a man shaped not by loud ambition, but by quiet resilience. The copper necklace, once mocked and questioned, now rested gently against his chest once more, not as an ornament, but as a symbol of an old promise. It reminded him every day of where he came from, of the countless unspoken sacrifices his family made, of the endless nights spent in windowless rooms with second-hand books and flickering light bulbs. But most of all, it reminded him never to mistake volume for vision in a world that rewarded those who spoke first. Sundar was determined to listen more. He began his post-Stanford journey working for a semiconductor firm and later a product management role at a startup that was barely surviving the dot-com crash. The culture of the American tech world felt unfamiliar to him at first. Open office plans, where people wore headphones but never truly listened. Meetings filled with buzzwords and aggressive timelines. Ideas pitched like weapons rather than shared like seeds. Sundar didn't fit the mold. He didn't interrupt others to be heard. He didn't boast of his credentials or inflate his wins, but what he lacked in showmanship, he made up for in clarity and precision. If he spoke once in a meeting, it was to say something that others would still remember to days later. It was in those years of quiet toil that his path began shifting towards something bigger. In 2004, Sundar interviewed at Google, then a fast-rising company known for its unconventional offices and its powerful search engine. He walked into the Mountain View campus with a resume in hand, not knowing that the next decades of his life would be written within those walls. The interview panel was skeptical. Sundar was soft-spoken, his suit formal, his tone measured for Silicon Valley's fast and loose culture. One of the interviewers later admitted he didn't speak like a disruptor, but there was something in the way he thought. Sundar was asked a question during the interview that would later become part of Google legend. What do you think about Gmail? It was April 1st, the day the new email platform had launched. Many thought it was a prank. Sundar, who had not seen it before, calmly analyzed its potential, explaining not just what it did, but what it could do. He spoke not of features, but of users, how email could evolve into something smarter, how the interface could be simplified, how trust could be built through minimalism. He wasn't trying to impress. He was trying to understand. That difference was everything. He got the job at Google. Sundar began his journey not in the spotlight, but deep in the machinery of product development. His early responsibility was managing the Google Toolbar, a browser plugin that gave users direct access to the search engine from their browsers. Most engineers saw it as a small, utilitarian project. Sundar, however, saw something more profound. The toolbar, in his view, was not just a feature, it was an early bridge between people and the vastness of the internet. Millions used it, many from countries like India, where infrastructure was limited but curiosity was boundless. Sundar's talent began to show through in small but significant ways. He suggested that Google make its own browser, a radical idea at the time. Since Internet Explorer dominated the market, many inside the company were hesitant. Google had never built such a product. The risks were enormous, and Sundar, still relatively unknown, was advocating for something that would require huge resources, engineering hours, and executive trust. But he wasn't loud about it. He simply gathered data, built prototypes, made presentations, and laid out the logic, not just about what Chrome could be, but why it should be. When Sundar was finally given the green light, he didn't celebrate. He got to work. Years later, Chrome would become the most widely used web browser on Earth. But back then, it was just an idea powered by belief. Sundar led the team with his trademark calm. He asked questions, encouraged his engineers, and never tried to take credit. His leadership was so understated that some outside the team didn't even realize he was in charge. But inside the team, there was no doubt. People followed him not because they feared him, but because he made them feel that their contributions mattered, that every line of code, every late-night fix, every small detail added up to something meaningful. Sundar didn't just build products. He built people. He remembered what it felt like to be dismissed, to be the boy in the back of the classroom, mocked for wearing a necklace that others didn't understand. He knew the sting of invisibility, and so he made it a point to see others. He noticed the junior engineers who were too afraid to speak up in meetings. He stayed late after product reviews to talk with those who didn't have the confidence to ask questions aloud. He made eye contact, remembered names, and asked about families. In an industry obsessed with velocity, Sundar brought presence, and it didn't go unnoticed. Over the next few years, Sundar was promoted multiple times. He was given larger projects, Gmail, Google Maps, Android. Each time, he approached them not with ego, but with empathy. While others talked about features and monetization, Sundar always began with users. How does it feel to use this product? Does it solve a problem, or does it create one? Are we making life simpler, or just noisier? These questions, seemingly obvious, became his compass, and slowly, people began to realize that Sundar's strength was not in making noise, but in creating clarity in chaos. But with greater responsibility came greater resistance. Not everyone appreciated his style. Some viewed him as too soft, too diplomatic, too slow for the hyper-competitive culture of Silicon Valley. Executives came and went, pushing aggressive visions, restructuring teams, chasing growth at all costs. Sundar stayed steady, even when others around him panicked. When Android was criticized for being fragmented and buggy, Sundar didn't make public statements. He rolled up his sleeves, spoke with partners, fixed contracts, improved performance, quietly, steadily. There was one incident in particular that revealed the essence of who he was. In a high-level strategy meeting, a senior VP aggressively dismissed a junior designer's proposal. The room went silent. No one dared speak. The proposal wasn't perfect, but the tone had been cruel. Sundar paused, then turned to the designer and said, "There's something valuable here. Let's unpack it together." He wasn't correcting the VP or defending the designer. He was redirecting the conversation to value over ego. The room exhaled. The designer almost cried. After the meeting, one colleague said, Sundar didn't just manage the product, he managed the room. By 2015, as Google underwent one of the biggest restructurings in its history, creating a parent company, Alphabet, Sundar Pichai was named CEO of Google. The boy who once sat quietly in classrooms in Tamil Nadu, who sold a necklace for a plane ticket, who limped through ice with no insurance, who fixed broken radios with his father, that boy now led one of the most powerful technology companies in the world. But Sundar didn't change. On the day of the announcement, he called his parents. His mother wept. His father, stunned, asked, "What does this mean?" Sundar replied, "It just means I get to solve bigger problems now," and solve them. He did die as CEO. Sundar faced challenges that few could imagine: data privacy debates, misinformation crises, international regulatory pressure, internal workforce protests. But even then, he responded not with corporate speak, but with authenticity. In boardrooms, he listened more than he spoke. In interviews, he chose sincerity over spectacle. In crises, he didn't deflect blame. He asked how the company could do better. And through it all, the copper necklace remained, sometimes beneath his shirt, sometimes visible, but always close to his heart. It wasn't just a chain anymore. It was a story of a boy who had nothing, but gave everything. Of a man who chose to lead with empathy in an industry built on disruption. Of someone who proved that kindness was not weakness, it was strength refined by fire. The weight of quiet power. When Sundar stepped into the role of CEO of Google in 2015, the tech landscape was no longer the garage-born, college-dream startup ecosystem that had once defined Silicon Valley. It was now a battlefield of global expectations, political tensions, ethical dilemmas, and an ever-watching digital public. The moment his appointment was announced, headlines celebrated him as an immigrant success story. The boy from Chennai who had climbed to the summit of one of the most powerful corporations on earth. But Sundar knew better than to let headlines define him. What the world celebrated in a moment, he had built over decades, brick by invisible brick, each one layered with perseverance, reflection, and an almost monk-like restraint that had come not from privilege, but from discipline born of scarcity. He didn't walk into power with the swagger that many CEOs exude. There was no grandstanding, no celebratory press conference, no triumphant declarations. He arrived at his desk early, as always, with a stack of memos and a quiet expression. His first few weeks as CEO were not spent in strategic reinvention or flashy announcements, but in listening. He scheduled time with product teams, policy advisors, researchers, HR leaders, and international market heads. He didn't dominate conversations. He asked questions and listened deeply in those interactions. He wasn't just gathering data, he was gathering trust, the rarest currency in leadership. To Sundar, leadership wasn't about being the loudest in the room, it was about being the one people turned to when the noise got too loud. But it didn't take long for the calm to be tested. The years that followed were marked by turbulence. From government inquiries on privacy to backlash over misinformation, Google found itself constantly under fire. Headlines accused the company of everything from data abuse to algorithmic bias. Internally, employee walkouts, ethical protests, and workplace culture debates began rising. In the boardrooms, tensions simmered as competing priorities pulled at the seams of an empire that had grown too large, too quickly. The world expected immediate answers, strong words, definitive stances. But Sundar, as always, moved differently. There were moments when the pressure to react publicly, to fight accusations with counter-accusations, to draw lines in the sand, was immense. But Sundar often chose a path less traveled. He opted for deliberation over defiance, clarity over combativeness. When asked tough questions in congressional hearings, he did not evade nor posture. He answered with sincerity, even if it meant admitting the company had more work to do. We're responsible for building products that are useful, fair, and trustworthy, he said during one testimony, his voice steady, his words carefully chosen. And when we fall short, it's our duty to do better. Those words weren't rehearsed. They were lived. Behind the scenes, he led initiatives to restructure how AI ethics were handled. Even as the world criticized big tech for its failings, he greenlit multi-million-dollar programs focused on digital literacy in underserved countries. He met with human rights experts, privacy advocates, educators, even skeptical journalists not for optics, but to understand. He pushed Google's efforts in climate sustainability, accessibility, and multilingual inclusion, not because those things were trending, but because, deep down, he remembered what it meant to be excluded, to be in a room where your accent made you pause, to read a website in a language you didn't understand, to feel like the world was built for someone else. The copper chain around his neck still hung close to his heart, often invisible under his shirt, but always there. It had traveled with him from dusty classrooms in Tamil Nadu to the polished marble floors of global economic summits. It had been through airport checks, red-eye flights, and sleepless nights. It had listened to boardroom arguments, personal reflections, and video calls with his aging parents back in Chennai. To the world, it was just a chain, but to Sundar, it was a compass, a memory, a promise, that no matter how high he rose, his grounding would remain below the clouds. In 2020, as the world was gripped by the COVID-19 pandemic, Google's responsibility multiplied overnight. Misinformation surged, schools moved online, remote work became a necessity. People turned to Google not just for searches, but for survival, to find hospitals, to understand symptoms, to connect with family. The pressure on Sundar as CEO wasn't just corporate, it was humanitarian. Decisions had to be made. That affected billions. Should search results be filtered more aggressively? Should YouTube content be removed faster, even at the risk of error? Should ad revenue take a backseat to health warnings? Sundar didn't panic. He convened cross-functional teams, empowered health advisors, partnered with public agencies, and pushed Google's engineering teams to build tools for virus tracking and remote education access. He ensured employee well-being took priority, allowing extended work-from-home policies and expanding mental health support. He wasn't just leading a company through a crisis. He was shepherding a planet through confusion, and he did it without the dramatic flair the media often associates with tech billionaires. He did it as he always had, by working, not posturing, internally. Sundar's calm was not always understood by everyone. There were critics who felt he was too moderate, too slow to anger, too restrained. But those closest to him knew differently. His silence wasn't emptiness, it was evaluation. His slow words weren't hesitation, they were precision. In moments where others would explode, he would breathe. In moments where others demanded vengeance, he sought restoration. He was not trying to be the hero. He was trying to make sure the system worked for those who had no voice inside it. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, Sundar sat alone in his office, the moonlight tracing a pale arc across the window. The building was quiet, the air filled with the gentle hum of distant servers and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was the original copper chain, now aged, slightly worn, its color darkened over years of sweat and sunlight. He held it gently in his hands. It was not a symbol of triumph, it was a reminder that power without empathy is a weapon, and empathy without power is a whisper. But together, they could shape the world. He thought of the boy who once couldn't afford a computer, who memorized phone numbers because there was no landline, who fixed transistors with a screwdriver because buying new ones was not an option. That boy had made it here not because he was the loudest, not because he was the smartest, but because he had chosen again and again to do the next right thing, to be useful, not just impressive, to be thoughtful, not just brilliant. And that, in the end, was his greatest contribution to Google. Not a single product or feature or device, but a culture, a way of thinking. A quiet insistence that technology must bend to humanity, not the other way around. As the world outside debated power, profit, and platform responsibility, Sundar continued to build something more enduring: trust, not just with shareholders or governments or markets, but with the millions who had no idea what his job title was, but who tapped into a search bar every day with questions that revealed their fears, dreams, and daily struggles. He never forgot that behind every search, there was a person, behind every user, a story, and behind his own story, there was a copper necklace, a simple thread that held the memory of where it all began. The man who spoke softly to the world the years following Sundar Pichai's rise to the helm of Google were no less demanding than the trials he had already endured. But they were different in one fundamental way: his challenges were no longer confined to technology alone. They had evolved into a far more complex arena: the human heart, collective ethics, and cultural contradictions of a world forever changed by innovation. It was no longer just about designing cleaner interfaces or faster browsers. It was about designing a future where technology did not leave behind the very people it claimed to empower. And in this arena, Sundar's leadership became not just necessary, but irreplaceable. It began with a shift in how he viewed his own role. While many CEOs saw themselves as captains of capital, Sundar increasingly viewed himself as a custodian of access, a quiet gatekeeper to opportunities billions would never otherwise receive. He often returned in his thoughts to his childhood, in Ashok Nagar, to the boy who would walk miles to catch a bus, not to hang out with friends, but to find a bookshop where he could read science magazines without buying them. The idea that someone like him could one day influence which languages were prioritized on YouTube, which devices supported voice typing in Tamil, or how low-cost smartphones were distributed in rural districts, it was surreal, and yet it was real. And with that surrealism came an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He began traveling not just to conferences and summits, but to schools in underserved districts in Africa, to rural villages in Indonesia, to remote schools in Maharashtra. He would sit cross-legged beside students whose lives resembled his own decades earlier. Bright eyes, silent questions, the smell of sweat and pencil shavings in overcrowded classrooms. He didn't arrive with cameras or press briefings. Sometimes, local teachers wouldn't even know who he was until much later. But Sundar didn't go for recognition. He went because he remembered how isolating it felt to be curious in a place where curiosity had no tools. He listened to children ask questions about the internet, AI, and climate change. He watched how their hands trembled as they typed on keyboards. For the first time, he spoke with educators who used outdated books and chalkboards with cracks in them. And in those quiet, dusty rooms, he made decisions that would later ripple through Google's global priorities: expanding offline content access, promoting regional language support, investing in local coding boot camps, and launching initiatives to put affordable digital tools in classrooms across the developing world. Yet, as Sundar's reputation as a thoughtful global leader grew, so too did the scrutiny. He began receiving invitations to address not just tech forums, but parliaments, councils, and universities. They asked him to explain not just Google's role, but technology's role in shaping democracy, economy, and human connection. It was a heavy burden, especially for someone who had always preferred observing over speaking. But when he did speak, he carried the full gravity of his journey within each word. There was a steadiness in his tone, born not from rehearsed confidence, but from lived clarity. In a widely shared speech at the World Economic Forum, he said something that resonated far beyond tech. We must ask not just what technology can do, but what it should do, and that answer must come from a place not of profit, but of shared dignity. These weren't just sound bites. They were a reflection of how Sundar had come to view leadership not as dominance, but as stewardship. In boardrooms, he would often ask questions that surprised his colleagues. When reviewing a new product concept, he'd quietly ask, would this still be helpful if you were using it for the first time at a public library in rural Kenya? When discussing advertising policy, he'd ask, does this feel fair if the person reading it earns $2 a day and shares one device with 5 others? These were not the typical metrics CEOs used, but they became Sundar's North Star. Yet even within Google, not everyone aligned with this patient, thoughtful philosophy. As the company grew, internal tensions brewed between speed and safety, between growth and values, between revenue and responsibility. Employees who joined during the company's idealistic early days sometimes clashed with the reality of scale. Protests emerged, letters circulated, demands rose, and Sundar, as always, did not rush to speak. He walked the long road of engagement. He met with critics. He listened to protests. He addressed concerns publicly, sometimes faltering, sometimes cautiously, but always honestly. And over time, even his critics began to recognize that while he might not be the kind of leader who made headlines for passion, he was one who took pain seriously. He bore it. He didn't neglect it. He carried it with dignity. One particularly telling moment came during a private leadership summit where Sundar was asked, point blank, whether it was possible for a tech giant like Google to remain human. The question lingered in the air, heavy with cynicism. Sundar looked out the window for a long pause before replying. It depends, he said slowly, on whether the people building it remember the moments when they were not heard, not seen, not helped. Humanity can't be baked into code, but it can be carried into the decisions we make. One by one, that phrase, when they were not heard, captured everything about who he was. It was a window into his past and a promise to the future. He had lived in visibility, and so he refused to build systems that made others feel the same. Every policy he championed, every product he greenlit, every controversy he responded to, he did so with that invisible child in mind, the one waiting at the back of the room, unsure if his voice mattered. And yet, amid all this, Sundar never allowed his identity to become his brand. He didn't exploit his story for applause. He didn't write best-selling memoirs or sit for glamour interviews. He didn't start clothing lines or launch foundations under his name. He remained deeply private, often escaping public attention by fading into the very spaces he helped build. He would sometimes walk anonymously through campuses, watching how employees interacted, noting what posters were on the walls, what jokes were being made, and what energy the place carried when no one knew the CEO was watching. It was his way of measuring culture not by metrics, but by atmosphere. He never wore the copper necklace openly in public after becoming CEO. It remained tucked away, sometimes in his drawer, sometimes in his travel pouch, not out of shame, but because he didn't need to prove anything anymore. The world had finally begun to see the man behind the humility, and the necklace no longer needed to speak for him. Instead, it whispered to him, reminding him, on the hardest days, that you can be underestimated and still win, that you can be gentle and still be powerful, that you can come from nothing and still guide the world. And in guiding it, you don't have to shout. You can just build, quietly, consistently, and with heart. Legacy without applause. The years had moved like river currents, sometimes calm, sometimes wild, but always forward. And now, as Sundar Pichai sat on the rooftop of Google's Mountain View headquarters one quiet evening, the sky painted in soft shades of lavender and gold. It was not numbers or launches or market shares that filled his mind. It was silence, not the kind that followed speeches or decisions, but a silence more personal, a stillness that comes when a man who has always moved quietly finally allows himself a moment to pause. The noise of the world, the awards, the headlines, the criticisms, the celebrations had all become background hums. For the first time in a long time, Sundar was not thinking of what came next. He was remembering what had come before. He looked out across the sprawling campus. Trees swayed gently in the breeze. Young engineers, many fresh out of college, passed by below, laughing, tapping away on their laptops, discussing algorithms, features, problems to solve. Some of them had no idea who he really was beyond a title on an org chart, and he was at peace with that. He never led to be recognized. He led because he understood something the world often forgot, that the loudest voice in the room is not always the wisest, and that the truest measure of leadership isn't found in quarterly earnings, but in how much better the world is because you were trusted with the power to change it. The decisions he made over the years were rarely easy. He had said no to ideas that would have made billions but endangered fairness. He had defended teams when it would have been safer to stay silent. He had stood before governments, not to protect the company, but to protect the vision that access to knowledge should never be a privilege, but a right. Every choice he made bore the weight of his roots, of the streets of Ashok Nagar, of transistor wires twisted on his childhood floor, of books read by dim yellow light because the electricity had gone out again. That weight never left him. It never grew lighter, but it had become part of his balance, like the uneven step that makes a staircase climbable. People often asked Sundar about the key to his success. Some thought it was intelligence, others discipline, others still believed it was luck. But Sundar himself knew it was none of those alone. It was endurance through invisibility, the ability to keep going, unnoticed, unwelcome, uninvited, but never bitter, never broken. It was seeing everyone, because for so long, no one had seen him. His entire leadership philosophy, his patient meetings, his calm reactions, his reluctance to dominate came from one place, the belief that if you can make someone feel heard, you've already begun to heal the world. And now, in the quiet of this rooftop evening, Sundar's mind wandered back to something simple, a memory. His first day at Stanford, the walk from the airport, the overwhelming brightness of the campus, the unfamiliar taste of the cafeteria food, the overwhelming fear of failure. But more than that, he remembered sitting alone in his dorm room that night, holding the copper necklace in his hands. He had looked at it for a long time. He hadn't known why he brought it. He hadn't known then what it would come to mean. It was never about the medal. It was never even about the grandfather who had given it to him. It was about carrying something forward, something old, something quiet, something forgotten by the world, but sacred to the heart. That necklace had been judged, just like him, simple, undervalued, misunderstood. But in the end, it wasn't the world's understanding that mattered. It was what you chose to become anyway. In later years, Sundar would occasionally visit schools and community centers not in Silicon Valley, but in places where the walls were cracked and the chalk was the only form of technology. He never brought cameras, never announced his visits. He would sit among the students, answer their questions, hear their fears. One young girl once asked him if being CEO made him feel powerful. Sundar had smiled softly and replied, "It makes me responsible. That's better than power." She nodded, and that moment stayed with him, because it was truth. As the years passed, Sundar's role at Google evolved. Some suggested retirement, others advised writing a memoir, launching a fund, joining boards. But Sundar, in his typical fashion, did none of these immediately. He didn't view legacy as a performance. To him, legacy wasn't in what you left behind, it was in what continued quietly because of you, long after your name stopped being mentioned in headlines. And there were many such legacies. Teams he had mentored who went on to lead with kindness, products that made life simpler for someone halfway across the globe, policies that protected the vulnerable even when no one was watching, interns who once feared they didn't belong, now leading departments because someone had seen their potential when they couldn't. His fingerprint was not in bold, it was in brushstrokes. Even within his own home, Sundar stayed the same. He made breakfast on weekends, watered the plants, called his parents every Sunday, never once allowed his daughters to feel that fame or success elevated him above the everyday. He wanted them to know that greatness was not about being seen, but about seeing others. That humility wasn't a virtue to adopt, but a foundation to live by. Years later, when Sundar was finally honored with a Global Leadership Award in a grand auditorium in Geneva, the world's cameras focused on him once again. As he walked on stage, dignitaries applauded, his biography was read, and a video montage played, highlighting his achievements. But when it came time to speak, he took the mic with his usual calm, adjusted his glasses, and said, "Everything I've been given, every role, every opportunity has come not because I shouted the loudest, but because someone somewhere believed in my silence. I come from a place where people often go unseen. I've spent my life trying to change that." There was no thunderous climax, no theatrical gesture, just quiet, perfect sincerity. And that's what people remembered. Years after he stepped down as CEO, the Google campus named one of its walkways after him. Not a tower, not a monument, a path, winding, shaded, simple, lined with trees, with small plaques that quoted things Sundar had said over the years, short phrases, gently powerful. Kindness scales, solve the human problem first. Quiet doesn't mean small. Remember those who are not in the room. And beside that path, in a glass case embedded in stone, stood one object only. Not a medal, not a photo, but a thin, worn, copper necklace. No caption, no explanation. It didn't need one, because by then, the world knew. It had judged him once, but now it understood. The echo beyond the name. There comes a time in every story, not when it ends, but when it begins to echo, a time when the protagonist no longer walks center stage, yet his influence lingers in the choices others make, the values they carry, and the quiet courage they discover within themselves. Sundar Pichai's story had reached such a place that the media spotlight had moved on, and his name no longer trended as often in corporate headlines. The world he helped shape was still evolving through the silent architecture of his values. And that, in many ways, was the truest measure of impact, not how loud the applause at the end, but how long the silence afterwards still carries your voice. In the years that followed his transition from executive life to personal reflection, Sundar embraced something even more profound than global leadership legacy through mentorship, but not in the traditional, formal sense. He did not start a personal leadership institute, nor did he hold court at exclusive events where the next generation of CEOs gathered in designer suits with polished pitches. Instead, Sundar chose the unglamorous but deeply meaningful path of invisible influence. He began mentoring quietly young engineers, aspiring entrepreneurs, underprivileged students from underrepresented communities, people who reminded him of who he once was: unsure, quiet, talented, but walking just outside the circle of recognition. He returned often to India, not with a film crew or an entourage, but alone or with 1-8 at most. In Chennai, he visited the old streets of Ashok Nagar, sometimes unrecognized, walking past roadside vendors and tea stalls with the same sense of reverence one brings to a childhood temple. He spoke in schools, in modest classrooms where the air buzzed with heat and ambition, where children clutched notebooks like passports to a different world. He never lectured them about becoming billionaires or starting companies. Instead, he spoke of curiosity, of empathy, of the underrated strength of being consistent in a world obsessed with immediate results. To one student who asked how it felt to be one of the most powerful people in tech, Sundar replied gently, "You don't feel powerful when you're responsible for billions of lives. You feel small, and that smallness is the most important feeling to protect, because it keeps you honest." That humility was no longer surprising to those who knew him, but to the children who expected tales of dominance, wealth, and glory. His words were a revelation. He didn't tell them to aim higher. He told them to stand firmer. He didn't promise them the world. He showed them how to build their own. Back in the United States, his presence in the public sphere continued to fade by design. Sundar declined major commercial endorsements, stepped back from most public-facing roles, and spent more time with his family. But his influence remained embedded in the foundational frameworks of Google's global projects, and how products were localized for small languages, and how voice search was being developed for rural dialects, in how cloud infrastructure was prioritized for small businesses, and classrooms in underserved areas. He had built systems that carried his ethics like code not loud, but immovable. One former employee, reflecting on his time under Sundar, described him not as a tech visionary or a corporate strategist, but as a person who designed emotional architecture in a technological company. He wasn't remembered for launching the flashiest product or leading the most aggressive campaign. He was remembered for the way he made others believe that kindness could coexist with ambition, that humility wasn't weakness, and that success without soul was just noise. And then there were the stories passed quietly like folklore across campuses, startups, and late-night dorm conversations. Stories of how Sundar took time to answer an intern's long email. Stories of how he once sat in the cafeteria beside a janitor and asked about his children. Stories of how, when a young female engineer was doubting her future, he told her, "Don't measure your voice by its loudness, measure it by its truth." These stories, small in the world's eyes, became mountains in the hearts of those who heard them, because they came from someone who had walked through every corridor of invisibility and never once let bitterness take root. And in doing so, he gave the world a template that transcended industry. He wasn't just an example of a successful immigrant or a brilliant engineer. He was a proof point that the human spirit doesn't need to change its shape to fit into powerful rooms. It only needs to stand tall in its own form. At an event in Zurich, years after stepping down, Sundar was quietly approached by a young software developer from Egypt. She had no formal invite, no media badge, and spoke in halting English. But she told him something he never forgot. "I never thought someone like me belonged in technology," she said, her eyes welling. "Until I read about you. You didn't become someone else to lead. You stayed who you were." Sundar looked at her for a long moment, then smiled, not the corporate smile of PR appearances, but the smile of a man who saw in her words the full circle of his life. He didn't offer her advice. He didn't hand her a business card. He simply said, then, your story is just beginning. And he meant it, because he knew that the end goal of leadership was not to build a pedestal for yourself. It was to build a pathway for others. He had done just that, not with grand gestures or viral quotes, but with choices, with consistency, with empathy in boardrooms and dignity in silence. His name might fade from headlines, but in a small school in Tamil Nadu, where a teacher explains the internet to children, for the first time in a tech startup in Lagos, where a young woman engineers, her first app in a refugee camp where children learn to speak through voice recognition software. In their own dialects, that is where his legacy breathes, not loudly, but endlessly. And so, the man once judged for a simple necklace had given the world something far greater than a product or a platform. He had given it an example that no matter who you are or where you come from, the world cannot silence the light of someone who walks gently, but carries their truth with quiet fire. Because in the end, it was never just a necklace. It was a seed, and he had planted it everywhere.